I didn't hear the entire presentation, but I'm sure it was very flattering, as usual. So thank you very much. You'll see on the first slide that I slightly changed the title. You know, I gave the title Labraunda and the 4th century BC architectural experiments. And then working on the paper, I thought then maybe we could refine this very general title into Enlightenment, into equation. I mean, always speaking about Enlightenment, Barbaric Hellenism, or local Pragmatism. And that's really the question that I would like to tackle at the end of my presentation. I don't have, you know, I mean, in archaeology, you rarely have a definite answer to questions that you ask, but the most interesting part of archaeology is trying to answer, not really finding the answer. That's the
So I think we have serious problem of connection. Let's see when Olivier comes back, what we can do.
Oh, you don't see anybody. Ah, it came back.
Yes, but your slideshow is gone in between.
What? No. Okay, anybody there?
We are here.
Okay. I'm sorry. It quit Zoom and then restarted. So I'm very sorry. So before we start speaking directly about Labraunda, I need to give a bit of a historical context about the site and the region. Labraunda is a site that's located in Caria. Caria was the southwestern region of Asia Minor. Its geographical frontiers are basically in the north, the Meander Valley, in the south and west, obviously, the Asian coast, and in the east, it is a question that has not been really tackled. The eastern frontier of Caria has shifted a lot through times. And since we're going to focus on the 4th century, well, that's a really good question. The frontier of Caria in the east in the 4th century is a big problem. I mean, sometimes it's limited to the Marsyas Valley, maybe to the Asos Valley, but probably not further east, although you find some eastern sites and cities that are really Carian in cultural backgrounds, such as Karnos here. And so people have the tendency to put the Indus Valley as the easternmost limit of the Carian region, which is probably not true. The political history of Caria, and now I'm not going to speak about the Bronze Age, it's further away for us, and it's very problematic. But the political history of Caria starts really because of the Persians, in fact. When the Persians advance and control the entirety of Asia Minor after they defeated the Lydian king, they take over all the western part of Asia Minor, and they, as usual, divide the new territories into some administrative provinces called the satrapies. And for the west and for the southwest, they create a huge satrapy, which includes, in fact, Ionia, Lydia, Caria, and probably also Lycia. Okay, so that's a really big satrapy. This satrapy causes many problems, both internal and external, for the Persian king. So many problems that in the beginning, very beginning of the 4th century BC, the Persian kings decide to divide this huge satrapy into smaller ones. And basically is going to, let's say, cultural division that existed once before. So it's going to create a satrapy of Ionia, satrapy of Lydia, and another one of Caria. And now starts the really interesting thing, because usually when the Persian king would create a satrapy, he would nominate a governor, a satrap, to be placed at the head of the administration of this satrapy. And most of the time, if not all the time, the satrap is part of the very close sphere of influence of the Persian kings. I mean, it could be a brother, it could be a cousin, it could be a very close commander. It is usually somebody that is sent from Persia to the satrapy itself. In the case of Caria, it is not absolutely unique, but it's almost unique. He decided to choose one of the local dynasts. Caria at that time was kind of a mosaic of small principalities, and we'll come back to that later. And one of these principalities had its center in Mylassa. You see my mouse, the city of Mylassa. And he decided to choose the dynasty of Mylassa, whose name was Ekatomnos, to become the satrap of Caria, so a member, an official member of the administration of the Persian Empire. So most of you probably did not hear or ever about Ekatomnos, but you surely heard about his firstborn, Mausoros. Mausoros, the very famous guy who had this monumental tomb built in Halikarnassos in the modern city of Bodrum. The fact that this family became the satrapic family, I mean, and this is also very unusual because usually the position of satrap is not hereditary. But in the case of the Ekatomnids, it became hereditary. Since after Ekatomnos' death, Mausoros became the satrap. He was married to his sister Artemisia. When he died, and that's also most unusual, Artemisia assumed the throne until she died, and it's only after she died that Idrius, the little brother, married with his sister Ada I, came into power together. And when Idrius died, Ada became the satrap. And then there is a bit of a political trouble, since Pixodaos, the very little brother, couldn't wait to become satrap. So he made a coup and sent Ada away in 341 and became the satrap. And then it came back with a deal between Ada and Alexander the Great. But again, I mean, this is not our question here. So as I say, the Ekatomnids, they were coming from Mylassa, and that position of being a satrap gave them enormous power. I mean, basically the satrap in the Persian Empire could do whatever he wanted. He only had two very important duties toward the central power, the Persian power. The first one was to gather soldiers and to send soldiers when needed. And the second one was to send the tax, the phoros. So it means that they not only had the hand on military power, they also had the hand on the economy. And the Ekatomnids grasped these powers and tried to transform profoundly Caria, or at least they succeeded in part, unless they were not in charge for a very long time. I mean, basically in the 320s, they completely disappeared with the death of Ada I. What they did, and we'll come back to what they did in details, but what they did especially is that they focused on the site of Labraunda. As you can see, Labraunda is located not very far away from Milas, which is the ancient Mylassa. It's only 10 kilometers away from the city of Mylassa, high up in the mountains. And in Labraunda, we know that there was a very important sanctuary, and this sanctuary became even more important because it was associated not only to the city of Mylassa, but directly to the power, to the dynastic and satrapic power of the Ekatomnids. And this is very clearly seen on the coinage of the Ekatomnids, from the very first of the satrap, Ekatomnos, down to the last one, Pixodaros. Every single satrap indicated or showed this Zeus Labraundos, the god of Labraunda, the Zeus of Labraunda, on his own coinage. Labraunda is famous already in antiquity. I mean, whether you read from Herodotus to Elian, ancient writers have been speaking about Labraunda. Herodotus, who is, I remind you, somebody who was born in Arikanas, so half Greek, half Carian. So he was very familiar with the Carian inland, and especially probably with Labraunda, which he must have visited. I mean, Alicante is barely, I mean, something like 45, 50 kilometers away from Labraunda. So it tells us that in Labraunda, there was a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus Stratios. I'm not going to tackle this question of the Zeus Stratios, Zeus Labraundos today. But the sanctuary was very famous. It became very clearly a sanctuary dedicated not anymore to Zeus Stratios, but to Zeus Labraundos from the 4th century onward. And we're sure about that thanks to many, many inscriptions. So knowing these references to Labraunda, interest have been triggered very early in time, in the 18 and 19th century. The site was basically rediscovered in the mid-19th century, not by Philippe Lebas, who was a French scholar, but by another person. But Lebas was the very first one to document the site. And you've got here the reproduction of one of the drawings that he did at Labraunda. He was convinced that this major building, and I show you pictures, I mean today's picture of the same building, very impressive building, was obviously the Temple of Zeus, which it is not. Now we know that it is an antron, and it is especially the antron of Idrius. But all these sources, both iconographical sources from the 19th century and the ancient literary sources, triggered this the attention of this man, Axel W. Persson, who started excavating in Labraunda in 1948. And when he arrived in Labraunda, well, it looked like that. But you know, late 1940s excavations, they arrived, a bunch of archaeologists and a fistful of archaeologists, like 4 or 5 of them, and many workers. And in a very pretty short period of time, they uncovered most of the site. You see here the work in 1950, 1951, and today, well, let's say that 90% of what you see, well, we've been working and excavating, but let's say that 90% of what you see here was opened up in the period between 1948 and 1970. So we've got a pretty good idea of how Labraunda looks like. All the questions have been raised on its identity, especially during the 4th century. But still, we've got a good idea, at least, of the historical development of the site. The site, when you first visit the site, of course, you're amazed by the quality of the conservation of its architecture, but you're very much your attention is attracted by this huge rock that is located right above and in the middle of the site. It is a gneiss boulder that is cut in 2 different parts, you know, as if Zeus would have sliced it with his axe. And we always thought that, you know, when the Greeks or other people in antiquity decided to create this kind of extra-urban sanctuaries, it was not just because they liked the place, you know, but because this place meant something. And we always thought that the particularity of this place reside in the existence, in the presence, and in the site must have started there. And in 2012, if I remember well, when we were doing a very simple cleaning at the foot here of this huge boulder, and especially at the foot of this niche, which is probably a cultic niche, we found very interesting remains associated with very early Bronze Age, late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age material, as well as pieces of obsidian. And those levels were dated to the late Chalcolithic. So we kind of were right to imagine that the site started there. But we've got a huge gap between this very early period and occupation. We don't even know whether it was already a sanctuary at that time. There was an occupation for sure. What was it? We've got absolutely no idea. But the next step, I mean, the next trace of occupation and of architectural activity in Labraunda, we have, I mean, in order to find it, we have to jump a few centuries in the 6th and 5th century BC. In fact, the first temple, which was built on the upper terrace of the site, was a very simple temple, Diastalinantis, and it was built probably in the late 6th century BC. At that time, and for a very long period of time, we always thought that the sanctuary was, the site was limited to this terrace, and therefore that the sanctuary was limited to this very little terrace. You know, a small terrace wall, very badly preserved. So it's been excavated and now covered. A kind of monumental high petrol access door. Probably here there must have been a terrace wall that disappeared in the later transformation, during the later transformation of the site, and this very small Diastalinantis temple with a small altar to the east. So for a very long time, we thought that the site was limited to this. But now that we started digging, and digging sometimes deep, we find traces and witnesses of early occupations pretty far away from the temple terrace. I put here some red dots to the southeast of the site. And well, basically, I can tell you that every time we go down, and we didn't go down in many places. We went very deep here and very deep there. And we found occupation layers and construction dating from the 6th and 5th century BC. So there is a brand new question that needs to be asked concerning Labraunda and its importance and shape in the early period, especially since when the Catamnids reached power and they decided to make Labraunda, transformed it from a local site, probably what they would call a come, that's a small village, into a major regional center that would become the display of the power, economical power, political power, and when they would try to enhance the cult God, those Labraundos, and associate the cult to their own power, that I am supporting the God who is himself supporting my authority. They proceeded to profound transformation, starting by the construction of a major series of terraces. I mean, we're speaking about almost 25,000 square meters of terrace in the 4th century BC, high up in the mountains, more than 7 high. This is a major work, and even in Central Greece, you don't see at that period of time this kind of arrangement. You have to go up to Macedonia, and this is even slightly earlier than the large palace work and terracing work from Macedonia. So the main problem with this work of the Catamnids is that, as you can imagine, producing and constructing those huge terraces, it has erased most of the old buildings, if they were there. So that is a major problem, especially since they built on the top of those terraces a lot of building themselves. So it's hard to go and look very deep, because then you have to dismantle the 4th century building, which is, as you could see on the picture, pretty well preserved. But still, we've got some openings. Coming back to the 4th century, well, as you see, it's a major architectural program that starts to the southeast of the site with the construction of 2 very large propylons, very typical Greek propylons, distal in antis, with a double facade. You see a facade on the outside and a facade on the inside. Most of these buildings, they're easy to date, well, just because, in fact, they have the dedication, the inscription. And here you see I put the inscription. This door to the Labraundoi, to those Labraundos. And this is not the only building that has been dedicated. So many of them carry this kind of inscription. Many of them also do not. But because of the work that we've been conducting concerning relative chronology, we are able to pinpoint some major construction that are dating to the Hecatomnid period. This is not the case for this very specific building at the entrance also, which is what we call the Doric House, because for a long time we knew it was Doric. We couldn't identify the function of this building. Well, it is a fountain house. So in the literature now, you can see it as Doric House or fountain house, a major construction entirely built out of gneiss, except for the facade, which was built out of marble blocks, tetrastyle in antis, and here again carrying a dedication by Idrius, and the same kind of dedication. Idrius, son of Hecatomno from Mylassa, dedicated this. There is a problem with the Hiera and Klenen. It is completely restituted to those Labraundos. Between this and the other buildings that have been dedicated, we find a series of huge constructions. Those have not been dedicated, but their location compared to the ones that are clearly identified make them Hecatomnid with no. This is a major construction. I'm sorry I didn't put a picture with somebody in front of it. It is absolutely huge. I mean, the doors here are almost 4 meters high. It was so big that when it was excavated by the Swedish team in the 60s, they called it, and on some of the plans that were published, they called it the Hecatomnid Palace, the Palace of Mausoleus. Now we know that it is a substructure carrying a stoa on the top. We'll come to that. And there is this very large, very impressive monumental staircase, 15 meters wide, 10 meters high, that is obviously dating from the Hecatomnid period and part probably of the procession, the sacred procession that was being carried out during the annual festival at Labraunda. And then we reached, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, it's a brand new discovery from last year. It is a series, it is a very large stoa, so we don't really know the limit of this stoa, but probably something like 40 meters. We opened up a trench here, and I spoke about that during lunch today. That this is a major Hecatomnid building, a large stoa, which is backed by a series. Here you can see 7 small rooms that might, we need to confirm that, be interpreted as banqueting halls. This building looks very much, is almost identical to the East Stoa, which I will present soon after that. So we reached the third terrace. We went to the first terrace here with the entrance, the second terrace with this large banqueting hall, if that is, or stoa at least, for that we sure. And here is, in fact, the largest terrace ever built by the Hecatomnids. It's almost 12,000 square meters by itself. It is completely empty. It is a very interesting feature in Labraunda. The spaces are completely empty. If you're careful, you will see that all the buildings take place on the periphery of those large places, starting for this terrace to the east with the east stoa, a stoa that has been partly excavated along very, very nice stoa. And on the back of this stoa, you can see a series of 6 different square rooms. You've got the plan here on the right. And one of the specificities of those rooms is that if you look carefully at the organization of the room, you will see that the door is never centered. It is slightly put out of center and translated to the right of the door. Well, this is very typical for a banqueting hall. Here you've got a reconstruction. This is a completely theoretical representation, but I might explain here as well with the reconstruction of the East Stoa. The banqueting hall dictated that every member who participated in the banquet would have an equal access to everything, access to voice, access to food. Everybody is equal. There is not somebody that is above somebody else. And for that, everybody had to stay in the same position, in the same direction. That is basically standing on your left arm, lying on the bench, standing on your left arm and picking food from your right arm. And you would pick food from a small table that is located right in front of your bed. So that is one very clear principle. The second principle is that because everybody's has to be equal, you cannot, for example, in a corner, put a bench that would abut against the wall here. Because if this bench here were put down to the contact of the wall, then this person would not have access to the food. So the bench has to stop before the wall, and then another bench starts, and so on and so on. So you see, here you've got, for this wall, you've got a long bench and the bench in width, and we've got exactly the same principle here. This bench cannot reach the wall, it is forbidden. So the next one starts perpendicular, and so on, and so on, and so on. As a result, if you look at the organization of the benches to the right and to the left of the door, of the entrance, you can see that there is a dissymmetry. I mean, the right one has 1, 2, or 3 full benches, while the left one will have 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 benches. And that explains why the entrance of the entrance to this building is always out of center. So this has been identified as banqueting halls. Banqueting halls, which is very interesting because we've got another one opposite to this. So basically, this is the andron here. This andron, we know pretty well the architecture, although it's basically completely destroyed. Fortunately, we were able during the excavations to find many architectural pieces, including probably the most important piece, which is the dedication by Mausolus, carved on the architrave of the building. One can read Mausolus, son of Ekatomno, aneteke dedicated ton androna, this andron, kaita enteo, eneonta, sorry, and everything that's within the building, di Labraundoi to Zeus Labraundos. So we'll come back to this building. I'm not going to detail it more, but this is a very unusual andron. I mean, those are andrones, and that's fine. I mean, that's something that we know everywhere else in the Greek world. This kind of size for an andron is pretty unusual. So if we continue traveling through the site, and now we reach the top of the site with the temple terrace, we see that this area has also been profoundly transformed during the Catomnid period, with first the construction of this very large terrace wall that replaced the old little terrace wall so that they could enlarge the space. And here again, a completely empty space. They would preserve the eastern propylon, although it was not anymore high petrol, but it was probably covered at that time. So the main access to this temple terrace to the east, and to the west, they transformed the little Daestalinantis late 6th century temple into a major peripteral temple exastyle in Antis, and this also was carrying a dedication which is badly preserved, but as you can see here, we've got this piece of architrave, where you can very clearly see Idrius Ekatom something. So we can rebuild it as Idrius Ekatomno Milassus, aniteketo noun di Labraundoi, which is basically me Idrius, son of Ekatomnos from Milassa, built and dedicated this temple to Zeus Labraundos. But that's not all. If we look further to the west of the temple, to the north of the temple, and that is probably the oldest construction from the Catomnid themselves. Why? It is a store, and we understand that because of the amount of earth which is located above us, they definitely, before doing anything, they needed to secure this falling earth, and that is probably why they built this tower first. This tower also has a dedication, but a dedication that's not carved in the architrave of the building, which is fortunate because the architrave was changed in the Roman period, but on a entablock. And the fact that it is located on the entablock, which is unique in Labraunda for an Catomnid dedication, and also the style of the writing seems to indicate that this was the very first building. And this building we know very little about. I mean, there is this reconstruction that is probably faulty, that has been drawn from, in the 70s, from a couple of soundings that have been put inside the. We already proved that this is a wrong drawing of it. And this is not finished. We continue to the left, to the west of the temple. Behind the temple, you had two major buildings. One is called the Oikoi, simply because it's written on it. Again, here we have the entire, and this is the only entire dedication. All the others are fragmentary. The entire dedication on the architrave that says Idrios Ekatomno, again, Idrios, son of Ekatomnos, aneteke tous oikos di Labraundoi. So me, Idrios, son of Ekatomnos, built and dedicated those oikoi to Zeus Labraundos. And immediately to the south of this building, we've got this major building, which is the emblematic construction of Labraunda, the one that was drawn by Philippe Lebas in 1844. Which is the andron. Now we know it's an andron because the excavation of the building has revealed pieces of architrave here, which carries here again an inscription, a dedication by Idrius, son of Ekatomnos from Milassa, dedicated this andron to Zeus Labraundos. So as you can see, I mean, this complete transformation of the site, the frenetic architectural activity, the shape and the name of the building, the naos, the oikoi, the propylon, the andron, all those gives a very serious Greek taste. And as I should emphasize again, those people were not Greek, they were Carians with a Carian background, cultural background, which was not Greek. And moreover, the head of this community, Carian community, was a satrap of the Persian Empire. So if you put this and that together, it's not working. Many scholars have been trying to understand what the idea of the Ecatonists behind this transformation, especially starting from the architectural background that was uncovered at Labraunda. And the main idea of those scholars was that, those Ecatonic guys, they were Philhellene. They loved the Greeks. They loved the Greek culture. Hornblower, in the Bible that he wrote, Mausolus, and published in 1982, said, the Ecatonists, they are the prototype of the Hellenistic kings. They announce this kingship that will widespread after the time of Alexander. They say, he says the Mausolus is the last of the satrap, but probably the first of the Diadochi, So, and when you see this kind of representation here above, of a lateral view, a front view of Labraunda, and you compare it to the 1984 representation of Delphi by Tournaire, you get the taste, And Labraunda has also very often been compared to those major Greek sanctuaries, very typical, very canonical, as Delphi. So the main idea was to say, okay, somehow these people, they were not Greek, they were part of the Persian Empire, they were part of the administration of the Persians, but somehow these people were completely engulfed, and they were welcoming with open arms this Greek culture. But of course, it never really works like that, especially since we start, if we start looking at the architecture of those very Greek buildings as they seem. I'm going to show you a few examples. We start, for example, with the most simple, the Doric House, the one I presented earlier, this monumental fountain, it is a building of Doric order, tetrastyle in antis. The size is good, comparable to Greek buildings. The type of the building is comparable to Greek building. What is very interesting here is that if you look at some of the details, and especially at the fluting of the columns, this is not the guy who drew it who was lazy. Those columns are really like that. Those are plain columns, but it is a plain column that is topped by a very short beginning of a fluting. So for a while, people who worked on that, and especially Pontus Hellström, who is the archive of Labraunda, offered the interpretation saying, probably the building was never finished. They started fluting the columns from the top, as they always do. If you go and visit the Didymaeon, the Temple of Apollo, you understand how these flutings were done. And we decided to accept this idea. But then the problem is that we saw that specific feature also in the East Tower and in the southern I was mentioning earlier. So this is a trait, and this was built and carved this way intentionally. It's not the proof of some kind of unfinished work. So as you can see, even in the smallest details, we some shifts, some very clear differences between what should be Greek and the canonical Greek architectural rules of, for example, here the Doric order, and some architectural projects from the Ecatonists. But this is very slight. We can go heavier. If we look at the Oikoi, for example, I'm sure that you've taken some architectural history courses on Greek architecture, and that facade must shock you somehow. Because as you can see, we've got a very nice building. Here again, tetrastyle antis. It is larger much larger than the fountain house that we saw before. But there are many things that should shock you. Starting the most, the clearest one is obviously the entablature of the building. We see a Doric colonnade that is supporting a Doric architrave. Okay, no problem until that, but above the architrave, then we start to have big problems because you've got an epistyle made of an ovolo, which is typical for the Ionic order. And then you've got the frieze, which is completely blank, which is also typical from the Ionic order. So here we've got something that is unthinkable in the Greek architectural world. This is something that is breaking the rule of architecture as we know it in Central Greece. And moreover, if you have a look at the building itself and at some details, you can see that you find these clamps. You see these iron clamps, horizontal base, but on a vertical base. So they would also use clamps in the very wrong way. But that's not the worst part. If you look at other buildings, and the two largest building of the site, actually, the Andrones, the Andron A and the Andron B, we have a lot of problems. I mean, those buildings should not exist. I mean, basically, that's the idea. Why shouldn't they exist? Well, first, the inscription tells us those are Androns, and I put them in red. And you see, those are not words that have been restituted in the inscription. Even if the inscription is fragmentary, the word Andron exists both for the Andron A, which is the Andron of Hydrius, the one on the top, and for the Andron B, which is the Andron of Mausolus below the temple. But an andron this size is not known. I mean, an andron is a room for banqueting in the houses, in the sanctuaries. I mean, you go to the sanctuary of Asclepios in Kos, and you'll see that all the stoa around the temple on the very topmost terrace, they are backed by these very small square rooms, you know, the entrance. Here, the dimensions are completely crazy. Those buildings measure 22 meters long and more than 11 meters wide. So we started thinking those may not be andrones, you know, maybe they wrote, but it's not. So when we excavated, we were very careful as to document, especially the ground of the original ground of the building, and we could figure out the presence, and you can see it here, of badly preserved, but still very clearly seen, this very little platform that was surrounding the entirety of the building. We've got an evacuation of the water on the left, and this confirms that those were used as banqueting hall. But what kind of banqueting hall? Especially since you look at this huge niche. I mean, this is not the wall that's been destroyed. This is a very, very large niche. I mean, this is 6 meters wide, and it was high. It's 2 meters above the ground, and it was as high as the roof itself. And this kind of niche, or not niche in order to put your vessel, your drinks, or your plates, no, those are monumental niches. And in this kind of monumental architecture, those niches were built in order to receive a large representation. And probably, since we're very close and connected to the sanctuary of the Labraundas, we always thought that there should be, in fact, probably in antiquity, the representation of a large statue of Zeus Labraundos. And we got a hint from this stele that was found in central Greece, in the Peloponnese, in a site, in an ancient site called Tegea, which is another sanctuary. But it is a very, very interesting representation, since it is the only representation where we can see a representation that looks like the niche in the andron. And it is Zeus Labraundos, and we know it because he's carrying on his right arm, on his right shoulder, the double axe. And we know it because it's written Zeus, and we know it also because you see the guy to the left of Zeus and the lady to the right of Zeus, and they are called Idrius and Ada. So the idea when we are thinking about reconstructing, I mean, what the andron looked like was to reuse that, saying, okay, in those monumental niche, probably we had the representation of Zeus and the couple of the satraps, probably in the andron of Mausolus and Artemisia framing Zeus Labraundos, and in the andron A, the andron of Idrius, maybe this very same representation. And we even suspect that the person who carved or had this stele carved in the 4th century BC probably visited Labraunda and reproduced something that he had seen somewhere. So this is how we reconstruct the interior of Labraunda. Okay, it's fine, it's fine. We can understand that this is a large banqueting hall, but we have another problem. We have another problem because, as I told you earlier, when I spoke about the east door, the door should be out of center. It should be out-centered. The plan of the building should be, shouldn't be, should be not symmetrical. And the fact that the banqueting was done in a very certain way, in a very precise way, leaning on your left arm and carrying the food on your right arm, is also known by the Carians. You've got here a representation of the Carian dynasty. I do not dare mentioning the name of this dynasty, whether it's Hecatomnos, Mausolus, or Idrius. This is very much discussed. It is from the sarcophagus in Uzunyuva, which is a monumental tomb that was discovered some 10 years ago in Milasa. But that's a tomb of an Hecatomnid dynasty, whether it was used or not. And you can see that this banqueting culture is very much embedded in the Hecatomnid cultural background. The problem is that our building is perfectly symmetrical. So how do we fit the idea of an andron that carries this value of fairness, equality, and the symmetry? I mean, how do you fit the banquets? This is very complicated unless you say, okay, maybe if there is a symmetrical arrangement, if you want to put up the beds within this symmetrical arrangement, you need to have a symmetrical arrangement of the beds as well. With to the left, when you enter to your left, you've got the beds with people leaning on their left arm and eating with their right arm, and to the right, people leaning on their right arm, reverse, and eating with their left arm. So this is one strong possibility of how it was arranged. The problem is that once we figured out that and started calculating the size of the beds that should be located along the walls of the andron, we figured out that we had another problem right here at the bottom wall, at the back wall of the building, and that whether there should have been one very, very little, one normal bed plus one very little bed, or a bed that was larger than the others. And if you put everything together, if you build this building symmetrically, you've got the people to the right looking toward the bottom of the room, people to the left looking toward the bottom of the room. Bottom of the room, where you find this huge niche, probably hosting a representation of Zeus Labraundos, framed by the dynasty, plus the presence of a very large niche, where knowing that this building was built and dedicated by Mausolus and the other one by Idrius, well, this is where the satrap probably was sitting. So this is a very interesting reinterpretation of the banquets toward the filters of a higher hierarchy expressed in the organization of the people who were invited at these banquets. And it must probably have looked something like this, with, in the case of the entrance B, you know, see Mausolos probably on a higher bench than the others, and the guests surrounding him, just like Mausolos was the center of the society, and the aristocracy was, you know, surrounding the central figure. But this is not the only problem that we have with the two Andrones. Actually, when you look at the reconstruction of the facade, and this is a reconstruction based on architectural pieces that were found during the excavation, here again there is something that's wrong in the architecture, or that's supposed to be wrong in the architecture, because what you see is up to here, you see a very, very canonical, kind of canonical Ionic construction with Ionic anta, very beautiful Ionic columns, and very detailed Ionic capitals. But above that, then the style changes radically, because we have a Doric architrave, which is carrying a Doric frieze, and a very canonical Doric architrave and Doric frieze. So again, this mixture of architecture is completely unknown in the 4th century BC. And if you put a Greek architect in front of that building, the guy would become completely crazy. But this is not the only rule that they broke. If you look at the acroter on the angle of the roof to the left and to the right, you see the presence of two different sphinxes. Those sphinxes surmounting cultic buildings in the Greek world is not unusual. It's on the contrary, something that's pretty basic. We found the Sphinx, of course, at Labraunda, and that's how we can reconstruct this facade. And yeah, as you can see, it's a very kind of specific Sphinx. You know, it doesn't look at all like the typical Greek Sphinx, which is a female figure, unlike the one in Labraunda, which is a very male figure, bearded, carrying the polos and so on. So when you start looking at possible comparative material for this Sphinx, there is only one place where you can find this kind of Sphinx, and that is basically in Persepolis. And the representation here, the repeated representation of those Sphinxes on the wall of the palace of the great king in Persepolis is almost the exact model of the one that is reproduced here in Labraunda. So basically here, what did the Hecatomnid do? Well, they built a building that is supposed to be typical Greek, the Andron, it is a Greek idea, with a Greek architecture, but that breaks the rule of the Greek architecture while introducing orientalizing cultural feature. So the question that was asked after the publication of this kind of material and the reaction of the scholars were those ones. From the 60s to and even the late 90s and the early 2000s, well, the Hecatomnids are barbarians. Okay, Tomlinson, who is a very big name, tells us, well, we can see in Labraunda the Hecatomnid barbaric misinterpretation of Greek architectural forms. And Hornblower also says the barbarism of some of the Hecatomnid architectural details is rightly insisted on. And Linders and Hellstrom speak down more prudent, and they speak about Greek architecture promoted by indigenous Philhellenism, where basically the main idea is that, well, these people, they are barbarians, okay? I mean, they're not Greek, they're not Persians, they don't have this cultural background that you need when you want to build something nice, and they picked up some idea here and there, and they tried to build as Greek and as one of the finest Greek architecture, but they couldn't because they just didn't have the background. Okay, they misinterpreted this architecture, which is kind of interesting because already in the 60s and the 80s and the 90s, we knew that Mausolus, the Andron B, was also the guy who had this monumental tomb built in Halicarnassos. And we've got sources mentioning the fact that the top level architects and workmen from Ionia, so that's the Greek world, Oikoi in Asia Minor, but the Greek world participated in the construction of this building, including people like Pytheos. And Pytheos, we know also that he built the temple of Athena Polias in Priene, and because of the very many similarities, because this temple and the Temple of Zeus in Labraunda, we also think that Pytheos participated, at least in Labraunda, at the reconstruction of the temple. And knowing that the Andron B was probably the masterpiece, it was much larger than the temple itself in size and in decoration. It was much more adorned. It wouldn't be surprising if he's the best artist that worked both on the temple and on the mausoleum also worked in the Andron. So it means that if they built the Andron this way, this wrong way, they did it intentionally. So the question is why? Why did they do that? And in order to try to answer to this question, we need to have a look at a bit of an historical background. What's happening in Caria at the same time, you know, in the 4th century? And we see that this is a period of profound changes. The Carians are not completely, you know, without any cultural background. I mean, they had a very strong culture, which was a Carian culture, including the Carian language. And before the Hecatomnid, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of epigraphical sources, but we've got a lot of graffiti. And most of this graffiti and most of these inscriptions are written in Carian, starting from the Hecatomnid period, and especially from Hecatomnos. There is a switch. The administration, it is not true for the, let's say, funerary inscriptions and so on, but those are personal inscriptions. But the official inscriptions, the official text, abandoned completely the Carian language and the Carian script and adopted in probably in one night the Greek language and the Greek script. And this is especially seen in the coinage. You can see the pre-Hecatomnid coinage. Here is a coin from Kaunos with Carian letters, and starting with the time of Hecatomnos, you can read the name of Hecatomnos here written in Greek. So a profound change. If somebody tells you tomorrow, okay, you cannot speak Turkish anymore, tomorrow you have to speak German, okay, but that's a profound change. And this was not the only change. I mean, if you about coins, you look at the coins, we see that before the Hecatomnid times and even under the Persian rules, there was a huge variety of local mints. There was a very rich coinage. I mean, almost every single dynasty that was at the head of almost every single settlement had the right and the power to mint its own coinage. Well, the Hecatomnists will put an end to that. They're going to probably forbid all the local coinage, and they're going to produce a dynastic coinage, a coinage that is attached to their own authority, to their own power, and that would have to be accepted by the entire population of Caria. So that's another change. If you look at the settlement pattern is also completely transformed. Before the Hecatomnids, most of the settlements, they were in fact little compounds located on the top of the mountains. You see, this is a very typical arrangement, circular, concentric arrangement of this Carian settlement. In the 4th century BC, the Hecatomnids will have a huge urban activity. They will create cities and cities and cities, but cities based on the Greek model. Cities with a fortification, with an agora, with a theater, most of the time with a bouleuterion. We'll come back to that. So again, another very deep transformation. And those transformations must have been hard. people in Caria. We've got sources mentioning some of those dynasts, and they were very numerous. But as I told you, we've got very little sources. So unfortunately, we know only some of them. But Artemisia was queen of Halicarnassos. Damasitimos was king of Kalinda. Aridoris was tyrant of Labraunda. We've got to mention of Istiaios at Termera, and etc., and etc., and etc. So what we know is that there must have been a very strong aristocracy at the time of the Hecatomnids. We also know from a series of inscriptions some incidents happened in the time of Mausolos. I put one of those texts here at the bottom left. And we can read on that text that since Arlisis, son of Tisoros, sent by the Carians to the king, and when we're speaking about the king, we're speaking about the Persian king, abused his embassy and abused Mausolos. So he tried to trick Mausolos, who has been a benefactor of the police of the Milasans, both himself and his father, Hecatomnos, and their ancestors, and the king convicted Arlisis of wrongdoing and punished him with death. So what are we reading here? We are reading somebody who is the ambassador of the Carians toward the great king of Persia. So obviously this is a person of importance, and it belongs probably to the aristocracy of the Carian society. And this guy who's been sent to the Persian king tried to betray Mausolos. In which way? We've got absolutely no idea, but he's acting against Mausolos. And that's very interesting because it's not the only source that we have about that. We have 4 different inscriptions. I put 3 of them here. So the one on the top left is the one that we have, we just saw now. The one on the right, which is carved on the same stone as the first one, well, those 3 are carved on the same stone, actually. Mentioned a certain Peldemo. And this Peldemo is accused of having tried to destroy the Eikona of Hecatomnos. So he attacked the statue of Hecatomnos. And you know, of course, that the statue of a known person embodies the person itself. So if you attack the statue of this person, it's an attack directly toward this very person. And also, this was done toward the statue of Hecatomnos. It was done under the satrapic rule of Mausolos. And worse than that, what you see here is that this third inscription tells us that a certain Manitas and Pactuos decided to, attempted to kill Mausolos, son of Hecatomnos, to hieroi to Labraunda, in the sanctuary of those Labraundos. And those inscriptions are dated from the 375, between probably 370 and 380 BC. And this is something like 25 years after the Hecatomnids came to power. So what we gather here is that there was a very, very, very strong contestation probably from the aristocrats against the Hecatomnids themselves. And that made me think about another scholar who wrote, Ruzicka, who wrote in 1992, but not because of those inscriptions, but because of the profound changes and the adoption of the Greek language and Greek architecture. Ruzicka says, well, the Hecatomnid domination of Caria marks the beginning of the end of Carian history. Well, for him, Caria was dead. And then I thought that probably these aristocrats who were the head of their community, who had the right of life and death on their own population, living by their own rules, minting their own coinage, living in their own mountain, they must have felt completely stripped of all their own authority. And that must have created a very strong reaction. And part of this reaction might also have been felt by the people. which was not, surprisingly. So we understand that somehow the Hecatomnists succeeded in convincing the people to change. And when we look at the very same inscription, what we see are very interesting features. We learn from those decrees that Mylassa had actually an ecclesia curia. It has a court, and that Mylassa was a police. And the term police is not just to say the city. The police has a political definition. So it means what? It means that the Hecatomnists did not only transformed the daily life of they also transform their political organization by empowering them. They gave people the right to decide, the right to vote. They gave them power. And this is one of the most, to me, seducing interpretation about how and why the Hecatomnists acted this way, by changing everything. They were trying, to my understanding, to redefine what was being Carian. It was not Greek, it was not Persian, it was this, it was Carian. Because they had to cut very clearly with the old Carian way of living, the old Carian way of deciding and of political organization and so on. So they had to redefine entirely what was Carian if they wanted their own power to have a chance to survive and not to succumb to the reaction of the population. So give population better way of life, a new identity that comes together with an increased power in the community, within the community, and then you might win and gain political stability. And political stability they got, because although the Hecatomnists were in charge only for a few decades, I mean, from the 390s to the let's say the late 330s, so it's 60 years, that's all. But they left an incredibly profound print into Carian society. And the changes that they did, they were never reversed. On the contrary, their memory were entertained centuries after centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. It was really very interesting. And also it has been completing very well what we have done in the previous class, because we spoke of how to rediscover the Greek archaeology, and then we finished the class telling that, in fact, okay, Greek archaeology, but of Greek archaeology in Anatolia will be something else. And then you did a perfect demonstration of that. So let us see the question. I mean, I already have a question, but I will ask at the end if it has not been asked already. So, I mean, please feel free to make a comment, or Julien.
Yeah, Julian, of course, yes, he's got questions.
Julian.
Good to see you again. Lovely to see you again. Wonderful talk. I know the site quite well, as you know. I hope the excellent honey is still available there. The wonderful honey that they make at the site, I hope that's still there. I was rather intrigued by the combination of, you know, Doric and Ionic, and I couldn't help but think back to Asos. You know, Asos is, perhaps I better, can you hear me? No, probably not. I'll write it down on the chat.
No, it's okay. I can hear now. Tell me.
Okay, right. I was rather intrigued by that because, of course, you've got this sort of very strange temple at Asos, which combines Doric with Ionic, and it's kind of like they're experimenting there. And I can't help but think, doesn't the temple at Samos have triglyphs on the Ionic temple there? It's not really my field, you know that, so you can cut me off at any point.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't. Where the triglyph?
It was really a comment that you've got this mixture of Doric and Ionic. Okay, and it just reminded me immediately of the Asos and the experiment there.
Asos.
Where you've got the Doric and then you've got the Ionic frieze on it.
Yeah,
but
it's true.
Isn't it in the back of my mind, isn't there an Ionic temple with triglyphs somewhere else in Ionia?
No, no. But you're right about Asos. Asos has a Doric architrave, and on the top of the architrave, you've got a frieze without the triglyph. It is true. It is true. That's one, to my knowledge, the only example of combining orders. But since Asos is the oldest standing temple of Doric order, you might say, okay, but you know, it's the beginning of something. And we should look at this is something I should have done, look at the recent publication of the Temple of Asos that came out a few years ago. I didn't on that question, but later on you will have combination of orders, but not in the 370s. Never that early. You have it in a later time. Yes.
Other question? No. So actually, I think Aziz, you have a question. If I'm not Aziz or Ali, I forgot. Last week, when I showed the Sphinx, do you remember? I mean, one of the last slides, and then you were very surprised. So you asked me, it was you, Ali, I forgot.
Yes, very well.
You have a question, actually, and I told you, I mean, ask to Olivier. So now it's the chance to learn about that.
I remember. Because I don't know much about the region and the specific period. But the presentation was very informative for me because everything was new. So, but it enriched mine. I understand that by now that we have some intriguing mosaics in the region. Speaking of culturally, and I was asking with this. This looks like what was the statue? Was look like a very Eastern looking, very Mesopotamian looking, and then I understand that why this culture shows itself in here. So I have no further questions. Thank you.
So you got the answer to your question.
Yes, thank you.
But where do you think that the Sphinx was made?
Oh, that's another very good question. I mean, this we've got no idea. I mean, how come such a copy could be done? I mean, it's very, very, very close to the Persian model. The problem is that we don't know who did that, and we don't know why it was carved. We did a work on marbles in Labraunda and analyzing the isotopic signatures of many marbles in Labraunda and try to analyze where the marble was coming from and so on. But of course, we couldn't take a piece from the Sphinx. And since it is a unique piece, it's almost impossible to give an identification. Well, we know that anyhow. I mean, when you look at the workmen who were working in Persepolis, especially, there were so many Greeks working there, and many of them were used as a stone cutter, and we've got very interesting data now on Greek style Persian statues or reliefs, especially in Persepolis. So it wouldn't be surprising that a Greek sculptor who would have somehow been traveling to the east and came back to Labraunda to carve this, because the question of the model is a strange question. When you think also about the organization of the andron, the large andron, it is the same organization as the one that you have in Persepolis in the Apadana. with the king. I mean, and the representation is always the same. The king, the Persian king, is always represented in the middle, surrounded by the aristocracy, as if the king was the center of the procession. You see it in the organization of the Apadana, you see it in the organization of the main staircase in Persepolis outside the Apadana, and you find the very same transposition of this organization in the Hecatomnid world. In the representation of, in the organization of the Antron, you've got that. You've got the king sitting in the middle, and there is a procession toward him. If you look at the iconographic organization of the statues on the facade of the mausoleum, you've got the very same as well. You've got this fake door with Mausoleus sitting, and there is a procession of the Carians, just like the Persian king sitting and the procession of the subdued civilizations, you know, going toward him, because the Persian king is the cement of the Persian Empire. Here we've got the very same idea. Mausoleus and the Hecatomnids are the cement of this new Carian society. And a very important question is, where did they get this model? I mean, they're living thousands of kilometers away from the Persians. How did they know this so well? A possible answer is when we look at the status of Hecatomnos. Hecatomnos was a satrap. And basically, most of the satraps' family were educated at the Persian court. The kids, especially the kids of the satrap, they were part of the Persian court in Persia, in Persepolis. So it is not completely crazy to think that Mausoleus might have been educated in Persepolis as a kid. I mean, Hecatomnos was in charge for quite a long time. And it is possible that at least as a teenager, Mausoleus went to Persepolis. I mean, we don't have any proof of that. But as the son of a satrap, he had all the rights to be educated at the Persian court. And it would be surprising if Hecatomnos didn't seize this opportunity.
Thank you. So any further question? So I have one more. I mean, in fact, I have many, but I find this mixture of Persian art and Carian art and Greek art, I mean, in fact, fascinating. So if I understood right, I mean, Labraunda was really a focus place. I mean, it was a known place. People were going to the sanctuary. It was, I think, a pilgrim even. Yeah. So then, did strange architecture that you have been showing to us, I mean, this mixture of Ionic and Doric, can we see it in other place, other side of Caria? I mean, is it something unique to Labraunda, or did it do a kind of school? I mean, did it create a kind of current, I mean, a kind of trend in architecture in Caria?
Yeah, the problem is that Labraunda is the most extensively excavated site in Caria. And because of the topography of the site and because of the amount of architecture that was in Labraunda in the 4th century BC, it was very dense. You could not transform this architecture. So all you could do was to add new buildings. In the Hellenistic period, they added a few stoas. In the Roman period, they added bath buildings and another stoa, and so on and so on. So it was adding and adding and adding. And the fact is that since Labraunda is very far away and located away from urban areas, it was very well preserved, and it stayed like that. And that's why we've got so good information about architecture, I mean, Hecatomnid architecture in Labraunda. When you look at the other sites that are Carian, founded in the Hecatomnid period, think about Halikarnassos. Halikarnassos should be a gold mine for Hecatomnid architecture. We've got nothing. we know about the mausoleum because it was excavated, but again, it was just the mausoleum itself. The terrace of the mausoleum was never excavated, and now you've got a huge city on the top of it. So it is very, very complicated because you need to be able to dig the entire building to make sense of the pieces. You've got from the Achaemenid period, Ionic and Doric pieces, but how do you put them together if you're not sure that they belong to the same building? When the Andrones were excavated, the first reaction of the scientific community was to say those Ionic pieces and Doric pieces, they come from different buildings, and they've been brought together in the Byzantine era, you know. But since we found that in situ in the Andron A and in situ in the Andron B, and that the blocks are working together. I'm speaking about how the dowels work. The dowel of the Ionic capital works with the dowel of the Doric architecture. There is no doubt that they belong together. But in order to be able to do that, you need a large site and you need to be able to open wide. And this site should not have been completely transformed through times, and unfortunately, that's what happened on. I mean, all of the sites, because Labraunda was not a city, moreover, so it was never heavily occupied, contrary to Arabanda, Alinda, Yassos, Halicarnassos, and all these other sites. So hopefully, one day we'll excavate, I don't know, Alinda, and we'll find a 4th century building that's mixing the same orders. But as for now, we don't have another example of that.
Thank you. And something else which comes to me very surprising, the stele that you have been showing, I mean, with Zeus in the... Yes? Is it okay, Olivier?
So because of the connection, I couldn't hear you, Jean.
Who is speaking?
You froze for a while, but now you...
I was speaking.
And who is I? Aziz, okay, so
Aziz.
we couldn't...
Sorry, I was going to ask a question, but because of the connection, I couldn't hear that you were speaking, so I will wait for you.
No, it's okay. Okay, then I finish my question, and then you will go on. So yes, my question is, I mean, this strange stele that you showed to us, I mean... with
the Tegea stele, yes.
You said it's coming from Peloponnesus.
I lost you.
Sorry? You lost me. So is it okay? So I'm writing.
Okay, it came back.
So I don't. Okay, so the stele, the stele, which is from Peloponnesus, which was found in Peloponnesus. What it was doing in Peloponnesus?
We've got absolutely no idea. We've got absolutely no idea.
Funerary stele, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a stele, and it was found in Tegea, but we know.
Tegea.
Yeah, in Tegea. And we know that one of the main architects of the temple at Tegea worked also in the 4th century on the coast of Asia Minor. So the idea would be to say, well, probably this is one of those architects, you know, I mean, when you see the work that's been done in Caria in the 4th century BC, it's a huge work which requires a huge workforce. Including a lot of specialists. So Mausolus must have gathered a lot of people that he brought from Asia Minor, from Ionia, but also, why not, from mainland Greece. And those people have been going back and forth. And it is not completely crazy to think that one of these people were, you know, also working elsewhere. And since Mausolus and must have been seen as benefactors of the arts in the 4th century. The fact that somebody decided to dedicate a stele to this family is not so surprising. But why Tegea? Absolutely no idea.
Very interesting. So Aziz, you have a question?
Yes. Firstly, Thank you for the presentation, Hocam. My question is about the sacred aspect of the site. At one place, you said that the sanctuary had a relation to Milas, or the center city. This reminded me of the relationship between Didyma and Miletos, or Eleusis and Athens. So, going with that, do you have any interpretations about some or any mystery cults like
sorry, Olivier is not listening. I mean, he wrote a chat. Can you write your question in the chat?
Okay.
He cannot. I mean, he just wrote it now to all of us.
It came back.
Aziz is writing.
Okay. I'm very sorry.
That's okay.
Well, Aziz, you can ask me. Now it came back. Okay. Can the relation between Labraunda and the city be related to the one between Eleusis and Athens? And do you have any interpretation for any mystery cults on the sacred site? Well, that's a very good question. I don't think so. Well, Eleusis is a site of mysteries. Labraunda is, I mean, is probably not. We don't have any kind of sources that might point toward this direction. So that's the easy answer. The hard answer is to think about the name of Labraunda. And Labraunda might come from the word labyrinthos. And the labyrinthos is also a place of mysteries. So absence of proof is not proof of absence. So we might tomorrow open a dig in Labraunda and find a mystery place and a subterranean place with lots of inscriptions mentioning the mysteries and so on. For now, we don't have that. We don't have that. I mean, as far as we know, it might have been at some point in the history of the site. Why not? But all that we know for now is that for the 4th century BC, it was really a place of display. I mean, go to Labraunda and see my power was the idea.
Thank you, Hocam. And that's the exact reason why I asked the question, because the word labyrinth is related to the mysteries, and also I think its origin place is the Minoan Crete. Do you have any particular findings that can be related to the Minoan period or from Crete? Could you hear me, Hocam?
I think he didn't. I think he's writing to us now. Yes.
Okay, no, you're back.
You are back? Okay. You are back as well. Okay. Aziz, again.
Hocam, could you hear any of the words I said?
No, you said yeah, because you thought about the labyrinthos as well.
Yes.
Didn't you say that?
Because rather, the culture of Labrius comes from the Minoan creed. And my second question was about that. Do you have any particular findings that you could relate to the culture of the Minoans or to the period of Minoan creed?
No, that's why they started excavating Labraunda in the 40s. Because they say, okay, I mean, everybody's running after this double axe cult. Let's go to Labraunda. This is a double axe sanctuary. So let's dig there. As I said very quickly in the beginning of my presentation, Zeus Labraundos is a very young god, probably invented in the 4th century by the Hecatomnids. Before that, the sanctuary was dedicated to Zeus Stratios. And that's what Herodotus tells us. And it's not a bad translation, because sometimes people say, Herodotus was writing for Greek people. So he transformed the name into something that the Greeks could understand. But it's not true, because Herodotus says, in Labraunda, there is a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus Stratios. And this is a very strange name, because this is the only Zeus Stratios that I've heard of in my entire life. So it's not a bad translation. It is a Zeus Stratios. So my belief is that the Zeus Stratios sanctuary was connected to Mylassa. And when the Hecatomnids took over, they wanted to transform this sanctuary into a regional sanctuary. So they had to cut the link between Labraunda and Mylassa. And that's why they changed the name of the epithet of the god. That's my idea. And yeah, poor Axel Persson, he came to Labraunda to excavate the Minoan layers of the site, which he never found.
Thanks so much, Olivier.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? No, so I think now it's time to say thank you, Olivier.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
It was a pleasure also to see you again.